Hey everybody, welcome to this month's episode of Don't Get Rusty. This one we're doing conventional wisdom, tailwheel world advice. Hopefully you get the sort of pun we tried to go for. So we're excited to talk about tailwheel flying today, and we have a special guest that we'll introduce here in just a moment, who reigns from probably the capital of tailwheel flying, Oregon. So if you didn't know that is the capital, we determined just before the show. All right, so real quick, I think, yeah, I'll go ahead and run through this and then I'll turn it over to you, Dan. So attendee control panel. So what we want to do is just, as always, just want to give you a really fast review of the controls so that you're good to go. If you are watching us on a computer, don't forget, if you've got a question, you'll see a menu that looks something like this. You would click on that little cartoon bubble that's got the question mark in it, type your question in here, and then click send. Make sure you click send. That's the really key part. And then if you're watching on a tablet, for instance, you'll see something that looks like a question mark symbol here. Type your question in here and make sure that you hit send. That is key, because if you don't click the send, we don't get it. And just so you know, we have an admin panel that will show, as it says right there, to the second, maybe even more than to the second, every reply in the order that it came in. So that's how we determine when these things happen, all that good stuff. So all good to go on that. As always, my name is Chris Moser. I work here at AOPA. I am a CFI, and I work to support flight schools and CFIs. And joining us today is our good friend, and by the way, his birthday, Dan Justman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the honor. Of course, I had absolutely nothing to do with it, but happy to be here today. Thank you, Chris. Dan Justman with the You Can Fly group. I get to work with the Flight Training Initiative, Rusty Pilots, and flying clubs as well. And more importantly than me, joining us today is Mr. Steve Bateman. Steve, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve. I work in the AOPA Flying Clubs initiative, and you can see some of the things I do there. But one of the most I'm proud of, I suppose, is being a nose flute player. So I was hoping to find my nose flutes and play us out later, but they're all in boxes. We recently moved from Frederick to Redmond. So there's some of the things that flying clubs do. We've helped start around 227. We started 2 new clubs yesterday. My colleague
Nice.
Drew and I, so that's good. We have lots of resources there. We do a number of R's, the seminars and webinars, which reminds me of a good old pirate joke. So what's a pirate's favorite letter?
Well, of course we think it's R.
No, it'd be B.
It'd be B.
Right, lots of example documents and all of that stuff available on our website. And you've got access to Steve and crew, the Flying Club's crew. Over.
And they've got, don't forget the cracking Club Connector newsletter. So make sure you check that out and subscribe.
Cracking. And it's published, it will publish this Sunday, the What's Osh Got to Do With It edition.
And always good titles just like that too. So make sure you check them out. All right, Stephen, tell us about yourself, Stephen. Actually, say hello first. Say hello, Stephen.
Hello, Stephen is the way.
If you get your Mandalorian reference, yeah.
Yeah, all right. So I'm coordinator of Flight Training Initiative. I do work with Dan and Chris here and keeping track of a couple different projects within You Can Fly. So my big thing is our annual survey. I get to help be a producer on our webinar series, just a variety of other tasks throughout the year.
But Stephen, what is, not only is it special because we've got Steve on board with us for Tailwheel, it's Dan's birthday, but on top of that, what else are we doing special today?
You may notice I have a photo of a t-shirt on the profile here. I have some shirts I'll be giving away today. I'll be sending some swag out to folks, anybody who might want one. What I'll do is throughout the presentation, I'll mention a phrase that has the word shirt in it, put a response in the question box saying you would like a shirt. First one who responds will get one sent out to them, and I'll check in with you later for contact and mailing details.
There it is. Hey, by the way, just real quick before I turn it back over to Dan, Steve, somebody is saying Alaska is tailwheel heaven, not Oregon. So we've got some people throwing some shade here. So
well, we knew they would, and I'm surprised the people from Nebraska haven't been on this argument as well.
Your home state. All right, go ahead, Dan, take us through.
Awesome. First, want to just thank Jeppesen, ForeFlight, Boeing family of companies for their generous support making Don't Get Rusty possible today. We couldn't do it without them. Grateful for the products that they have and the support of the You Can Fly initiatives and the Don't Get Rusty webinar. Also, Don't Get Rusty and You Can Fly programs are all funded and supported by the AOPA Foundation. So please learn more about that, learn about the difference that you can make, help support this and a lot of other facets in general aviation. None of the work that we do comes from member dollars. It's all donations, it's all support, and it's all for people who believe in general aviation and want to pass that on. So thank you to all of our donors. To learn more, please go to aopafoundation.org.
Perfect. And Dan,
Also,
it's the hot topics.
yes, of course, we're going to get questions. I'm surprised we haven't gotten any yet on this, but yes.
I have a question. Is there wings credit?
Steve, thank you. That was a brilliant segue. You nailed it absolutely. Yes, if you are watching this webinar live today, Wings credit is available. You need to have registered with your FAAsafety.gov email address, and if you've done that, you've done all that you need to do. We will take care of the rest. The webinar is also going to be up on YouTube. Give us a couple days for that. Just look for the AOPA pilot video channel and the Don't Get Rusty's playlist. You will not be able to get Wings credit if you're watching on YouTube, but you will if you're watching live today here on the GoToWebinar. And also, the webinar can be found down the road, AOPA.org webinars page. Just takes us a day or two to get that uploaded and posted. So Wings credit, yes, if you're watching live today. We just need to have your FAAsafety.gov email address. As long as you've registered for the webinar with that, you are all good to go.
Yep, they don't need to do anything. And Dan, what about, is this being recorded?
It is being recorded. Yep, sorry, I didn't say those exact words, but that's certainly what I was alluding to. It's being recorded, and that's where you'll find it on YouTube at the AOPA pilot video page here just in a day or two, and also listed on AOPA.org webinar page.
And if I could ask, is there Wings credit? I'm teasing. All right, so we already got that well covered. All right. Stephen, you want to tell us a little bit about what happened today in aviation history before we pop into tailwheel flying?
Why, absolutely. June 15th, 1921, Bessie Coleman earned her pilot license. What was interesting was she was the first African-American woman to earn a private pilot's license here. But being at the time that it was, she went to all kinds of flight schools where she lived in Chicago, and no one wanted to take her because she was African-American and a woman. So she went to France, and the French schools were like, well, okay, whatever. She succeeded, got her license, and went on to be a very famous aerobatics pilot. She did all kinds of stunts and interesting things and traveled around the US flying for entertainment.
And I just noticed here too, she's flying a tailwheel, oddly enough.
She is flying a tailwheel,
Amazing.
yes.
What are the chances?
I think that one counts as a tail dragger, actually.
I think you're right. Right there. Yes, that's because the wheel broke off.
That's right.
They didn't have small enough ones back then.
Yeah, I can tell you stories about wheels breaking off tail wheels.
Yeah, I know you can. I've heard you. I know at least one of those. All right. So Steve, we are really happy to have you here today to talk to us about tailwheel flying. So let's pop into this thing. So start telling us, what's the deal with tailwheel? Because we know that people always talk about how like dangerous and crazy it is. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So hello everyone. So you want to fly a tailwheel aeroplane, eh? Well, excellent idea. You get to fly some amazing aircraft, and you fly them more because it's so much fun. You get some fantastic places to go. It opens up numerous opportunities to go to different types of airfields. I think there's a bit of a fellowship of dragger pilots as well, just a little bit of a swagger as you get out of your tail wheel and take your helmet off and go. It's, I have to do that with my wig, but it still works. Is it hard? No, it's not hard, but if you fly a nose wheel aeroplane, it's likely to humble you, and that's of course why we get the training. But they ground loop all the time, whiny, whiny, whiny. Yeah, that's why we fly them, because they ground loop all the time. No, that's not what happens. They respond to pilot inputs, and you need to make yours the right ones, and so that's why you train. Do you need to be on your toes? Literally, yes, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So sign me up. How do I start? That's the right question, I think, don't you, Chris?
I would absolutely agree. In fact, why I brought you on is because I know you've got hundreds and hundreds of hours of tailwheel time. I did my tailwheel endorsement a long time ago, and it was fun, challenging, but that's why I said you are definitely the expert in this, so we're really happy to have you. So yes, that's the right question. Go do it. It is a good time.
Yeah, and you get to fly some really fun ones. I think the first dragger I flew was a 1941 J3 Cub, recently restored. It was just a fun aeroplane to fly. Okay, these are some of the things we're going to talk about. Preparation, right? Just like with anything, yes, you can jump in, and we all know where that will lead, or you can do some preparations to start with. We'll talk a little bit about the regulations, because it's interesting. The FARs actually call out tailwheel airplanes as requiring particularly the endorsement requirements and also the currency requirements. There are 3 rules. That's it. It's really simple. There's just 3 rules. We'll talk about taxiing exercises, because the difference of flying the tailwheel aircraft is not flying the tailwheel aircraft. It's all the ground handling. It's the bit where you're taxiing. It's the bit on where you're applying power, and then when you're coming in, touching down and slowing down. One of the things I think helps is if you can visualize what the yaw profiles are during takeoff and a bit on landing. There are numerous effects which conspire to make the aircraft want to turn left. At least the airplanes that we fly here, somewhat different. They may turn right in the UK, just because of some different phenomena. We'll also talk about cruise, which is really easy. They cruise like an airplane. Then the approach, landing. We'll talk about 3-point, and oh, there's a bit missing there. It should say wheel landing as well. That's my mistake. And then we'll talk about proficiency. Okay, press the button, Chris.
Let's do it.
So here's some preparation tips, particularly if you're flying nose wheel aircraft. And remember, this is a checkout. It's more than a checkout. It's a transition. You're flying a different type of airplane. And the FAA have made this very clear, because they published chapter 14 in the Airplane Flying Handbook. It's called Transition to Tailwheel Airplanes. And it's worth a read, and it's worth a reread, and it's worth a re-reread when you do your sort of proficiency training. I did a question of the month some time back in the Club Connector, the famous, well-read Club Connector newsletter, called "How Do I?" Award-winning. How do I learn to fly a tailwheel aircraft, and what's involved? There's some really good articles as well. The ones that I would point you towards, Steve Krog's articles in EAA Sport Aviation, are just excellent. They started in 2016, 4 parts. So you want to fly a tail dragger, have a look at those. Lots of video examples, of course. You can spend lots of money if you wish. They're great. A lot of visualization as well. The problem with some books is you can't really visualize things, but the great things about videos is you can visualize them. Lots of experts, of course, on YouTube, so pick your experts wisely. And there's some books there. These are some of the ones that I've found really quite useful over the years.
And
all right,
one thing I'll throw out there too is just to add on, all these, or actually wherever the links are appropriate for these different articles, check out the handout section here and in the GoToWebinar menu. You'll find the handout. I was able to get links for pretty much all of these, except for the books, because you just have to go and purchase those from wherever you purchase books. But go check them out. So you've got them all, and all of those listed there too, so you don't have to worry about trying to get them off the screen.
All right then, so something else to prepare before you even get in your tailwheel aeroplane. Think about trying to perfect some of the maneuvers you should well know by now in your nose wheel aircraft. So side slips in particular. You know, we don't do crabs on final in tailwheel airplanes. The idea is to set the airplane up so that it's aligned, it's over the center line, and the nose and the tail are pointing in the same direction, straight down the runway. And the way to do that, of course, in a crosswind, you've got 2 choices. Crab not being one of them, so really there's only one choice. So, you know, but go out there and practice your side slips. And this is a term I've been using recently. Practice until you don't get them wrong. It's really easy to practice until you get one right and say, oh, that's it, I've nailed it. But just keep going until you don't get them wrong. And we'll talk about alignment in a minute. Also, remember and go out and practice this when that power is a flight control. It's really, really important to understand what the power knob does as you're coming in on the approach, and particularly when you're setting up for the landing, be it a 3-point or a tail wheel or a wheel landing. Is to understand that power is a energy control. It's a rate of descent control, and of course that's why we should be practicing slow flight to understand what happens with power as a knob. The other thing I strongly suggest is you practice some low passes in your nose wheel airplane. Chris and I were talking about this the other day. We actually both use this technique when we're teaching primary students to fly in nose wheel aircraft. And teaching them how to land. It's getting comfortable close to the ground. It's understanding what it feels like in ground effect. And also, of course, if you're coming in and not landing, rather than pulling the power to idle, you'll actually be putting a squirt of power in. You'll be keeping some power in to keep you, I don't know, 10, 7, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 feet above the runway. It gets you comfortable with being close, and you'll understand definitely that what you do is push. You push on the power, you push on the yoke to remain level, rather than using that power to climb. You want to use it to stay level over the runway. So practice those. Next one, Chris.
Yep, absolutely.
Would you say staying level is best done with the right kind of shirt?
Well, it might be. Maybe people should just let us know if they want a shirt. First one gets it. All right. I think you let us know when you've got a winner there, Stephen. All right. And that low approach thing, you've heard me talk about that a bunch. I totally agree. Let's get to that next slide. Here we go.
So see, the other thing I find that people find difficulty with in any type of airplane is this notion of alignment. And if you look at the runway, this is a perspective of the runway. If you look at the one on the right-hand side, if that's what it looks like to you, then you're not aligned. And it's sort of a bit like that eye test. You go for your eye exam and you have to line up the two houses, or there's an air balloon, you have to, align over the field. Or sometimes they say, tell me when the short line at the top is aligned over the longer line at the bottom. And that's exactly what it is. If you're coming in on a runway and you see that sort of perspective, if it looks like that on the right-hand side, you are not aligned. And what I also find is people try to get aligned by using the rudder. They just try and point the nose of the airplane to the end of the runway. Unlikely to do much. You're going to physically have to turn. In this case, you're going to have to turn to the left and then S-turn to the right, so that you end up going down the center line. And I think it's really important to get well set up, not just on short final, but on longer final as well. You can also start feeling what the wind's doing, and that allows you to really set up the control inputs for that side slip. Do remember, of course, that as you descend, the winds are generally going to lessen in strength, and they're also going to back around the compass. So just be aware of that as well. And I think the point I'm making with these preparation tips is to practice, but also to be aware of some of the things that may bite you as you transition over to the tailwheel aircraft, and will also make you an even better nose wheel pilot as well.
Yeah, in fact, the only thing that we would recommend maybe you don't have to do this with is if you're flying an air coupe, then just go ahead and land. It's all good.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that's right. Use the rudders on an air coupe. Right. I think some of the early ones had them, and then they transitioned over. Anyway, let's talk about regulations. Right, press the button. So I'm not going to read it all. You can do that, but I just want to say that, look, you need to have received training and received and logged flight training from an authorized instructor in a tailwheel airplane, or received an endorsement in the person's logbook. So it's an endorsement. It's not a rating. It's not a certificate. It's an endorsement that you get by training. And look there, it says received and logged flight training. If you look at some of the other training requirements, complex, high performance, high altitude, all of those, they talk about flight and ground training. And yet the one that I think you probably need some good ground training on is not actually a requirement to receive and log ground training. I think you can go a long way of understanding the temperament of tailwheel airplanes by doing some groundwork. All right, next one.
And actually, just real quick, we do have a question from that last slide, which was, when you're getting aligned on the runway, the person's asking, do you slip to get aligned, or do you turn to get aligned? What do you recommend?
So I think you actually have to turn. If you think about a slip is a turn where you're not trying to turn, particularly a side slip, right? You think about how you get into a side slip. You lower the wing into wind. As you lower that wing, it's automatically going to turn, and then you stop it turning by putting opposite rudder in. So all you're doing is changing the flight attitude. And in fact, it's quite a fun thing to go and do when you're practicing your side slips, is set up the turn, a coordinated turn, and then uncoordinate by putting opposite rudder in, and see what happens, and look at the turn indicator. It goes from this to this because you're not turning anymore. So yes, you'll need to do some S turns.
So a little bit of turning. All right, here's that next part.
All right, so the next bit, it tells us what we need to do as part of our flight training, and it talks about normal and crosswind takeoffs and landings. I don't think I've ever seen a normal takeoff, and very rarely see a normal landing. There's always something that happens that makes them a little different. It's the crosswind bit that's really so important there. And then it also talks about wheel landings. We'll talk about wheel landings and what they are, but unless the manufacturer has recommended against such landings, and that's why you'd read the POH. In some aircraft are actually they're prohibited in the POH from performing wheel landings, and most of that's to do with what it looks like when you're in the level condition. Right, you're coming in on a wheel landing, you're generally coming in like this rather than like this, and that propeller can get rather close to the pavement in some aircraft with very, very big propellers, such as a lot of the warbirds. So most of those you will see coming in, and they'll be performing 3-point landings rather than wheels. And then the other one is go-around procedures. And the important thing there is go-arounds in general are important, but it's particularly the ones when you're just about to touch down, or maybe have touched down, and then you've touched down again, and then you've touched down again, and then you've touched down again. It's those.
That's how you get current very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. There's your 3. We've done our 3. It's those go-around procedures that are so important. And again, this reinforces the point I made earlier, that power is a flight control. It really is an important flight control knob. All right,
Actually, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, Steve, quick question about the sign-off for a tailwheel aircraft. Is there a grandfather clause for someone who's been flying it? The question is, what about being grandfathered on tailwheel aircraft? Is a sign-off still necessary?
I don't know. We'll have to look up the regs.
Yeah, and in fact, I can tell you there's a reg, and I forget the date, but the reg does say if you've logged a tailwheel time before the particular date in the reg, then you don't need to have an endorsement. You're okay to act as PIC.
But which, yeah, okay, then you have to, okay, then I suppose it'll be sensible then to at least get a flight review before you climb in after 50 years.
Yes, if you haven't been flying, then yes.
Yeah. So the other bit here is in terms of recency. We often call that currency, many times confused with proficiency, which are of course 3 completely separate things. But it talks about not carrying passengers of an aircraft, unless that person has made at least 3 takeoffs and landings within the preceding 90 days. And press button.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
If the aircraft to be flown is an aeroplane with a tail wheel, the takeoffs and landings must have been made to a full stop. So the point there is what they're trying to say is it flies, and you have to have your 3 takeoffs and landings to fly with passengers. But if it's a tail wheel, then it's the bit that's on the ground is really the important thing. You land it, you bring it to a controlled stop, and then you do a controlled takeoff to go around and do the next one. So it's what's happening on the ground that really differentiates this particular type of aircraft.
Exactly. All right, let's pop to it. Here we go.
So here's some examples of ground school topics. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, just cover all this all at once, Steve. Right now, go.
Yeah, go. All right. So here's there it is. Ground school topics. Next. So. So here's some things that I would recommend that you study or work with a CFI. Self-study is good on this as well, or actually go along to a ground school, a tailwheel ground school. I run them reasonably often at AOPA, and they're always well attended. So talk about the systems. We'll look at some photos of that. All the usual stuff as you go down there. Let's talk about brakes. So early tailwheel aircraft had drum brakes because that's what they had back in the day, and they were operated by cables rather than hydraulics. That's what they had back in the day, and they were useless, which was really useful because then you got to learn that the idea of the brakes was not necessarily to, slow you down quickly. It was actually to help in steering. And we'll see a picture of a minute of what can happen if you decide to upgrade your brakes to something like powerful hydraulic disc brakes. The other thing is how the brakes are operated. A lot of, particularly the older tailwheel airplanes, have what they call heel brakes. So not like our toe brakes, but they are heel brakes. Not quite coming out. Is it heel brakes rather than toe brakes. It's actually quite good, this.
That's not bad.
Yeah, put it to music. I'll get my nose flute out. So we'll look at some of those ideas, but bear in mind the differences in braking, and particularly that center of gravity position will cause some issues if you're not careful. A lot of tailwheel don't have flaps, so understand if they do. Torque and gyro effects are really big, and this is something that we'll spend a little bit of time on in a minute. We'll look at a graph, and I'll talk you through what is happening at different stages of the takeoff and different stages of the landing. The other thing is, if you think about a tailwheel airplane on the ground, it sits like this, and that's why we call it a tail wheel, because it's got a wheel on the back and it sort of stays there. If you look at that, it's got a natural built-in angle of attack, and when you're taxiing, you're going like this. Here's the relative wind. There's the relative wind. Here we're taxiing. So you can see you've got an absolute positive built-in angle of attack. So just bear that in mind as well, that it's not just a case of like when you're flying your Cessna, like an Aerobat, which, oh, what a wonderful aeroplane a Cessna Aerobat is. But if you're flying one of those, they're fairly neutral when they're angle of attack when they're on the ground.
Yeah, unbiased opinion.
Pardon?
Unbiased opinion on the Aerobat.
Yes, very unbiased. Trim, we'll look at trim, particularly the location of it. Another point to consider here, and I'll wait until I get to the photos, is the tandem seating arrangement versus the side by side. So here are some things to talk about. Taxiing controls, that CIDA is climb in, dive away, climb in, dive away, climb in, dive away. Make sure that's ingrained in your mind. The control positions on the ground or during taxiing. Climb into the wind, dive away from the wind. I've mentioned the word ground loop once. I'm going to mention it one more time, and that's probably it. And that's all to do with the center of gravity effects, where the center of gravity is, how the center of gravity influences the ground handling. And we'll look at a couple of pictures of that in a minute.
Yes.
How are we doing on questions?
We got tons of questions. I think we're saving anything you want to throw in there, Dan, or we just want to go ahead and move on?
Yeah, we're okay. We've got them coming up later, but I do want to notice, I did look up the regulation, and Earl also shared 6131I2, 6131I2. If you've logged tailwheel time prior to April 15th, 1991, then you don't need that endorsement.
Right, you're grandfathered in. Good to go.
Yep.
And by the way,
do you think that makes any sense whatsoever?
I guess it's just before they required the endorsement, so people had already been trained in them, I suppose was the logic there. They didn't want to make people have to go get an endorsement when they've been flying them forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Feel like they're shirting people on the regs.
They're shirting people? All right, Stephen will look for the winner there. Let's go ahead and move on. By the way, I know we'll have the slides, the books that are in the handout are good for a lot of this information. And I know Stephen will make the slides available when we put it up on the YouTube video, so you'll be able to have these notes. So don't worry, you'll get them. Here we go, next one.
Yeah, and there's some reference slides as well that you'll see when you get everything. So let's talk a little bit about system. So there's a pretty looking PA11. It's a Cub Special sitting there in the hangar, and you can see straight away that sort of idea of the natural angle of attack that I was talking about. So it doesn't take much forward motion to think about that wing's going to be generating lift because of the angle of attack that's already there. The next picture along, is your mouse working there, Chris?
Yep, right here.
Yeah, that one. So this is a tandem seating arrangement, and they're just so much fun to fly for various reasons. But look at this one. Oh, and by the way, on that, bear in mind that some aircraft use solo from the back just because of the center of gravity position. So J3 Cubs and others, I don't know, probably the Champs and airplanes like that, I can't remember, you would actually fly them solo from the rear. And this causes some interesting challenges. So notice this is the front seat, and it's got a nice, looks like 4-point harness there. Don't be surprised to have those. Then there's that sort of knob with the winder on it. Now you may think that's the window control for your old Morris Minor or your Morris Mini, but it's sort of like that, but it's actually the trim position. So you're in the front seat, your left hand is on the trim, That gets me to another point here, in that when you're flying one of these aircraft, your flight controls, the stick is in your right hand, and the other stuff, the power, is on the left, the trim's on the left, and that other knob in this case is the fuel selector. And of course, every airplane seems to have a different requirement of fuel selectors. A lot of Pipers only have left or right. Some of them have left, right, and both. So you've really got to familiarize yourself with those. And of course, the Piper Cub has that sort of little pokey little float on in front of because the fuel tank is right in the front, which is a really nice little fuel indicator. So one of the things you might want to do for preparation is go up in your Cessna or whatever other nose wheel airplane you fly with the CFI, but have the CFI in the left seat and you in the right seat. So now you're practicing with an aircraft that you're familiar with, but you're flying the airplane with your right hand on the yoke and you're using your left hand. And it sort of is like one of these sorts of things to start with, patting your head and rubbing your tummy, or whichever way around it is. It will feel quite strange, but it will help you when you do that transition to flying with the other hands. That other picture there, this is actually of a Stinson. This is a Stinson 108, I believe, and the rudder and elevator trim are up there in the roof. So now you're going like this rather than winding the windows down.
Like this one right now.
What was that?
I was just going to point out that this one, yeah.
Yeah. So the bottom left, that's the electrical panel and fuel gauge of an older PA-18 Super Cub. It looks like an older PA-18 Super Cub. Various sort of switches. The position of that is, this is the electrical panel, right? So it's the lights, it's the magnetos, it's the generator switch, and it's not here in front of you. It's typically up here. Just sort of above the window, above the left window where the electrical panel is. And that's another version of it there. The next one, that's a newer version. Notice the fuel gauge, they're typically fuel sights. They're canted a little bit. They're canted to show you, so when they're level, the tube would be level, indicating what the level fuel is. Many of them are actually calibrated. They have two scales, one for when the aircraft's on the ground like this, and one when it's in cruise flight. The next one's interesting. This again is a Stinson. So that flappy knob there, Chris, that one there, that's the fuel selector, left or right. And just above it, there's that, you can just see it, not the gauge, the little thing just above there.
Oh, right there.
Just there. That's actually, that's a switch, that's an electrical switch, which routes the fuel gauge sender to the one fuel gauge, which is just above I think it's just above it there, that one there. So you've only got one fuel gauge, but you've got two fuel tanks, and you're looking at the contents of the tanks by virtue of the switch. Nothing can go wrong.
Not at all. What could happen?
There's a nice panel. This is actually in that PA-18. They're using those nice Trig instruments, good company from the UK. And the point there is, if you're soloing this aircraft, if you were to solo this one from the back, it so happens that the PA level.
And hang on, we're just waiting on Steve there. I've been frozen for a minute.
Oh, may have some technical difficulties.
Yep,
Well,
we'll stand by.
I've got a great interlude question that came through. Is Chris going to be at OSH 23?
Why? In fact, I will be there. I think I'm there Monday through Thursday, as I recall. So I will be out at the booth. So come by and talk to us. We'll get Steve here. Steve, you're back. I see you moving. Do we have your audio? Oh, still don't have any audio. So go ahead and see what. There you go. I heard a little bit.
That was interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
That's why we practice.
Exactly. We're good
That's
to go.
why we maintain our proficiency just in case.
That's right. Engine out.
So just bear in mind, a lot of people have developed nice little sticks with rubber ends on, so that you can sort of push onto the radio knobs in front of you and change. Okay, next one. Let's move on.
Yep. There we go.
So there's an example of the heel brakes you'll see there. You get this notion, Dave Hirschman calls it the ballerina feet. You're sort of having your feet like this rather than like that with the toe brakes. It is highly inefficient, and I think that actually helps, because then you don't put too much pressure on the brakes. If you do decide that they're too ineffective and you change over to nice big hydraulic disc brakes, then you have to be really careful when you're coming in doing a wheel landing that you don't use the brakes to try and slow you down. You just use them, just pulse them. Essentially, that's what you do with tail wheel brakes. You're pulsing on them to help you with directional control. Notice that rudder there, that's of a PA-18. Notice this is fairly typical of a lot of tailwheel aircraft. Notice there's a lot of rudder below the horizontal stabilizer there. This is fairly typical in tail draggers where you're doing lots of slips, but also of aerobatic airplanes where you don't want too much fuselage shadowing of the rudder. So big rudder, itty bitty tail wheel, and that itself is something that can cause some challenges. Notice on the picture on the right how the steering is operated, the one on the right there, that one.
Yep, right here.
It's all done through springs. So whenever you're trying to steer with the nose wheel using the rudder pedals, there's quite a delay involved to get you doing anything and also when undoing it. So anticipate the turn in and the turn out. You can't just turn instantly. I had an incident in this PA-11, in fact, where one of those springs came off, and so I was not an ambi turner. I was like Zoolander. I could only turn in one direction. That was quite amusing trying to get off the runway. You know, I'm trying to get off runway 23 on Echo, and I had to turn left to do it rather than right. So you have to explain to ATC these things sometimes.
All right. Go ahead to the next one here.
Okay,
So
three rules.
and
Rudder pedals, stick back when on the ground. The little mantra I use there is nail the tail, nail the tail. And that's something I drum into my students as we're coming in, we're landing, the tail drops, is nail the tail. Keep that tail wheel on the ground unless you actually want it up, which is typically when you're beginning to take off, and then keep straight using rule 1.
Which is obviously the rudder pedals. Very good. All right, let's go ahead and take off. So we get into a couple of the maneuvers. We've got about just a little over 20 minutes left. So we're going to see if we can go through these different phases.
Yeah, so let's talk about the takeoff then. So everything you do all your pre-flights. By the way, on the pre-flights, I mentioned those springs on the tail wheel. Can you just go back to that picture a minute?
Sure.
There's 2 things I want to show there. Some of the extra steps you need in pre-flighting a tail wheel. You've got the springs and those chains there. You need to make sure that they're connected and connected well. Also, if you go up, so you see where the tire is, sort of go up there and you'll see where a bit more there. So that's typically a leaf spring like you have on a suspension of your truck. That leaf spring there needs to be a good integrity of that leaf spring. And one of the checks you can do is just bounce that tail wheel up and down just a little bit to make sure that there's no grating noises and crackling noises and so on. There's a number of other things that you'll want to do when you're performing your pre-flight, and your instructor will certainly work you through those. All right, next.
Okay. We're over here.
Stick back, nail on. So imagine what the start of the runway there. Everything's coming together nicely. We're pointing down the runway. We're of course on the center line. The stick's back because we're nailing the tail. Ailerons into wind. If there's any crosswind whatsoever, full into wind. Don't mess about. Smooth application of power. And this is when it starts getting interesting. So now you follow rules 1, 2, and 3. Use the rudder and staying straight. Stick slowly forward as you start gaining some speed. And the idea is to raise the tail. Now, if you are a first-time tail wheel pilot in the front of a tandem tail wheel aircraft, your instructor is in the back and probably can't see very much. First of all, the nose is the airplane's like this, and secondly, you're in the way because you're in the front. And it really is the biggest rush, I think, for any flight instructor to be in the back of a tandem wheel airplane with a brand new tail wheel pilot in the front, just as the takeoff roll is starting. Even though your CFI, you know, they may be whistling slightly to themselves, they may be humming, and they look maybe calm and so on. They are spring loaded. I guarantee your CFI is spring loaded, because even with all the ground school, even with all the knowledge, as soon as you start moving forward, things are going to go left. And you need to be aware that things are going to go left and there's going to be right rudder. So as well as nail the tail, the other thing that we say, of course, is, Chris, with any airplane is more right rudder.
Right rudder. It's constantly right rudder.
Right rudder, right rudder, right rudder.
And tap
and then
on
what you do is when you start developing some some control, particularly over the tail, at a remarkably slow speed, actually. You want to get the tail up. You want to be able to see, and I want to be able to see out the window as the poor instructor at the back. So you slowly push forward on the stick. This is completely alien to a lot of people. Pushing forward on the stick. And that's why we do those low passes to generate that feeling, that pushing forward when you're close to the ground is actually okay. If you're worried about prop clearance, sit in the airplane when it's on the ground and parked. Have somebody sit in whatever seat you're in. Have somebody lift the tail so that you're in that sort of takeoff level, sort of float off position. And then, you know, they can measure how much prop clearance there is, and you'll be surprised how much there is for most airplanes. So the next thing, everything starts going left, and we need to understand why so we can counter it at the right time. Let's have a look at this picture now.
Okay.
So I'm just going to give you 10 seconds to look at it because I know everyone's looking at it and not listening, and that gives me a chance to have a drink of water.
Yes, and it is a good picture too.
So what I'm trying to get across here, the vertical axis there, the y-axis is the left turning torque. So this is the left turning tendency of the aircraft. And the horizontal, the x-axis is time. And it may not be calibrated exactly to 5 seconds in your airplane, but you get the idea. So there's 3 things here. Can you go back to the previous slide, actually? Let's just have a quick look at that. There's these yaw profiles, and there's several things that are causing it. The slipstream. The slipstream is caused by the propeller slipstream going around the fuselage, and particularly, banging onto the tail, onto the vertical surface there. And because of the direction of the slipstream in most of our airplanes, it causes a torque a force to the left. Then there's engine torque. We've got this big engine. We've got rotating bits of metal, and as those bits of metal start rotating, we get a torque reaction. It's the old opposite, equal and opposite sort of reaction type thing, caused by the engine, not the propeller yet. This is the engine, and that causes a left turning tendency. Then there's P factor. Remember, even when we're on the ground, if we've got that positive angle of attack and we got some power coming in, that looks like a climb, and we're going to get P factor, the asymmetrical lift generated by the upward and downward propeller blade. And in our aeroplanes, it's going to cause a turn to the left. So, and then we've got gyro precession. This is the one, and you may see some examples. I usually do this during ground school, where I have a bicycle wheel that I hold up as a propeller. And even with a slowly turning low mass bicycle wheel, as you change the axis of that bicycle wheel, the whole thing tries to pull you one way or the other depending upon the rotation. So that's the gyro precession, and these all add up and conspire on this graph. So the first part then of the graph is when we're doing our ground roll. Can you go to the next one, Chris?
There it is.
Yeah, so we're applying full power, the torque reaction's increasing, so our left turning tendency is increasing. We're also getting an increasing P factor as we start getting some airflow over everything, and the propeller's doing its thing. There's airflow through the propeller, essentially. So that's why we get that increase in left turning tendency. We've also got the forward motion going on. So forward motion, we're getting some spiraling slipstream. So all of those are adding up. Now, at some point, we're just going along the ground and we're sort of going along like this. And then we get to that particular speed where we feel everything's coming alive and we raise the tail. We raise the tail. As soon as you raise that tail, you get an immediate pulse of gyro precession. You also get it's reducing the P factor because the angle of attack is essentially lowered, so you've reduced the P factor from the prop. But the pulse of gyro precession is just huge. And the fact is, I in the back seat want to get the tail up as quickly as I can so I can see where we're going. But the amount of the level, the intensity of gyro precession is directly proportional to the speed, the rate at which that tail comes up. So the idea there is lift the tail, but be nice and smooth so you don't get a huge pulse of gyro precession. Then you start going along like this, fairly level angle of attack, not much P factor. Then you float off and you climb, and now you've got full power. You've got the very positive angle of attack. You're getting lots of P factor, and you'll need to apply more right rudder. Now, if that's the profile of the left turning tendency, that's actually the profile of what your right foot should be doing at different times during the takeoff roll. And I think if you study that and just understand, you don't need to memorize it. Just be aware that I'm going to be using different amounts of right rudder at different parts of this takeoff roll. And you can imagine that when you're coming into land, particularly when you're coming into land and the tail drops, you're going to get a sort of gyro precession in the other direction. It'll now be a right turning tendency rather than a left turning tendency. So
Hey,
look
Steve.
way down the runway. And number 3, stay straight with rudder. Simple.
All right, go ahead, Dan.
Oh, yeah, quick question, and this was about raising the tail. We've got a lot of questions about technique, but I'm going to gathering those, and we'll save those for the end because I think we've got a lot of great material that may be covered here with those questions. But there's one that came through about raising the tail. Do you always want to positively raise the tail? I've been taught that on soft grass to allow the tail to fly off on its own rather than push the stick forward.
Yeah, and that's technique. Equally, if you look at some of the short takeoff and landing competitions that are happening, you see some people will just leave the tail down and then just, essentially pull it off to get a shorter takeoff. Others most definitely push the tail forward, and then not so much into a level attitude, so push it so that the tail comes up, but you're still maintaining a bit of positive angle of attack, and that can help you get off quicker as well. Yeah, I think that's a good idea for soft grass, is sort of keep it on there. I like, the other thing to remember with grass, particularly if it's long or other sort of mushy surface, you just have to watch for the nose over type of tendency. So the more you keep it back, the less there's likely to be that. And you are pushing forward on the stick, right, to bring the tail up. You don't want to push it so far and have so much friction on the mains that the nose then tends to drop even more. So it is technique. I agree with you.
Cool. And one of the cool things too, that is you were mentioning, Steve, that I think is just great, is that if you can, look, for me, I know when I put flaps in, and I teach my students this, you can anticipate the pressures that might be required for your airplane putting flaps in. Same thing here. These would just be things I would remember as I put full throttle. Think about it. I'm going to raise the tail. Something's going to happen. You can anticipate these pressures and be ready for them. So, all right, let's get to the next one. We've got about 13 minutes in our normal show here.
So cruise is pretty normal. A lot of these airplanes tend to have a slightly nose down attitude when level. So just bear in mind if you're using your sight picture, you might be a little bit sort of, it feels as though you're like this, but actual fact, if you look out to your wings, you'll see that the wings are pretty level with the horizon. That's just a nice picture. I managed to get a picture to show I'm absolutely at 4,000 feet and fully coordinated. I'm on speed, and click, I took the picture, and then of course everything went crazy, but I just like that picture.
That's a good one.
So cruise is pretty normal. Just recovery from climb to cruise. Again, bear in mind that as you pitch forward, you accelerate to the desired speed. You will continue to climb in a lot of these airplanes. They do want to climb, so you'll be bringing the power back to cruise RPM, more pitch forward, trim, and then eventually it looks like that. But just you will be doing the trim dance for a while until you get used to where the trim should be, the position of the trim during cruise.
Cool. All right, let's go to the next one, which we get into, of course, the one everybody wants to know about, landings.
Yeah. So read the POH for limitations, know the prop clearance. In a lot of these airplanes we're talking about, it's that there's a lot of, you have to be pushing way forward in order to getting the prop close to the pavement or the grass. So, which approach is different? Well, we'll ask you in a minute. Power is a flight control, it's the get out of trouble knob, particularly if you're coming in on a landing and everything's going a little bit squirrely. Add either a burst of power to help you get some control back, or just put lots of power in and go around. The go around is a wonderful maneuver that earns you full points rather than trying to salvage something. Power is also really useful if you do a bounced wheel landing. Sometimes you do a bounce on a wheel landing. You really need to put a little bit of power in there to just buffer you through the energy change, and then you can convert it to a 3-point usually quite simply, or particularly when you're learning, practice your go-arounds. So that's what a 3-point looks like. A wheel landing looks like this. Here's the Red Baron doing his wheel landing. There he is. No sign of Snoopy yet. And just to illustrate, this is an interesting picture. The next one. This is Bob Hoover doing his air show in his Twin Commander. But essentially, as you can see, he's got a serious slip going on there. He's touching down on one wheel. It's something that you might want to consider, particularly as an advanced maneuver, is come in on a good crosswind day, get your slip established, touch down on that upwind wheel, and then hold it there. Push slightly forward on the stick and hold it so you are perfectly going straight down the runway, perfectly over the center line, but with that sort of slip attitude in there. It really does give you some confidence about being on one wheel, close, obviously on the ground, but controlling the direction of the airplane.
In fact, another tip I'll throw in there, Steve, too, is when teaching crosswind landings, even in nose wheel aircraft, doing low approaches in a crosswind, a nice steady, strong crosswind gives you that similar attitude. It really helps people see that picture of what you're going to land like, getting that upwind wheel down first and so on. So
yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's a great way to learn any type of crosswind landing is to use the low approaches.
And
right.
one wheel landing will blow the shirts off the audience.
Shirts off. And there go the shirts. And Stephen, would you go ahead and roll the poll as well if you've got this? So we want to know which is best and when is it best? What type of landing is best? We're going to have the poll pop up here just momentarily. We'll leave it up for about 1 minute because we've got, I want to get back and see if we can knock through some of our presentation here before our official hour is up. Man, the things go crazy with the shirts. All right, looking at the poll. And there we go. Got lots of folks in there with the choices were, of course, which type of landing is best? Is it 3-point? Is it wheel? Is it both? Is it depends? And landings are for rookies. I don't land. I just slide it to a park. And somebody always answers that. There's silly ones that I put in there. So we've
That's
got.
what the handbrakes are.
All right, we've got we'll go to maybe like 70% here, and then we'll just let it go for 1 minute. Let it ride for 1 minute, and then we'll close the poll and see what we've got. I am seeing a trend happening here, Steve. I don't know if you're seeing the results as well.
No, I'm not.
Okay, we'll see those momentarily. Go ahead and close the poll, Stephen, just so we can, here we go. And so we should see the results pop up here. And you might see it over on the side. But anyway, we've got 3-point, 20% of our audience said 3-point, 9% like the wheel landing, or I thought that was the best. 12% said both. 57% said it depends. And of course, we got 1% saying landings are for rookies.
Yeah, there's always one. So, and of course the answer is it really does depend. You have options here, and use those options appropriately. Under normal circumstances, a 3-point landing is can be very appropriate. It generally gives you the shorter landing. Generally, Dave Hirschman did an interesting video article a year or so ago where he compared wheel landings and 3-point landings, and the myth of you come in faster with a wheel landing, for example, and usually you come in what I call a sniff faster, particularly when you're learning, but really you don't need to, as long as you've got enough control authority to be able to keep the tail up, then you're okay. It really does depend. Personally, again, just personally, I think the wheel landings are the best things on 2 wheels. I think they're so much fun, and they're great to practice. Certainly, I think under gusty conditions, I like that extra little bit of control that I can have with a wheel landing personally. I like to be able to see a bit longer as well. If it's a short field, I like to see where the end is, and I can see that more if I set up initially as a wheel landing. But practice, decide what you would like to do. Next one, Chris.
All right, you got it.
So remember, powers of flight control, if things start going squirrely, it's what I call 3 up. Push the throttle up, push the tail up, and straighten up. And once you've got those, you can then make a decision of what you would like to do. And my suggestion would be you just let her float off just like it would from a normal takeoff, because you're in the takeoff configuration there. All right.
Just go ahead and put these back one.
So just quickly, no, I finished with that one. Just quickly as to why tailwheel aircraft require a little bit more control. This is a nose wheel aircraft, and by virtue of the center of gravity being forward towards the nose here, that's what sort of forces the airplane onto its nose. And if you're coming in at a landing, this is a crab type of landing, the direction of travel straight ahead. That center of gravity, as soon as those wheels screech their way onto the tarmac, as they will in that configuration, they shudder their way down the runway. the momentum is going to force that center of gravity to be pulled forward in the direction of travel. And you can see that's going to be a self-correcting type of situation. The aircraft's going to essentially be pulled into the direction of travel straight ahead. Not so with the tail wheel. The tail wheel has the center of gravity behind the main wheel. So again, we have a tail wheel aircraft coming in with a crab. It touches down, it's shaking its way down the runway. Everything's sort of beginning to go wrong. But because of that angle now between the direction of travel and the longitudinal axis, there's an angle between that center of gravity, and momentum is going to try and force it again to sort of fling out. And as it sort of goes straight ahead and then starts flinging out, it's going to pivot around the main wheels. Now you can run the physics and see what angle you can get to, the angle between the angle of the essentially the axis of the main wheels and where the center of gravity is. And beyond a certain point, it's just not going to be recoverable. Now, it's a surprisingly big angle, so the idea is not to get in that situation. So skill prevents you from getting into this situation because you're going to be slipping in and not getting into that type of crab, but physics will determine if it's recoverable or not.
And you mentioned a great little demo you can do in the grocery store if you wanted to kind of get an idea of the way it behaves. Do you want to describe that?
Yeah, so go into the grocery store, pick up a grocery cart, one that actually works, and not the one with the tire that goes as you're sort of going down the aisle. But then have the casters are on the front normally, and the fixed wheels are on the back, so that's looking like a nose wheel aircraft. Load it up, put lots of bottles of water or something like that towards the front of the airplane, and then just push it, not the airplane, the cart, and then push it, and it tracks reasonably straight. Now just turn it around, and now the center of gravity is going to be sort of pretty much behind where the wheels are, but the pivot's at the back. And now push it, and maybe push it with a slight angle, and watch what happens. The cart will automatically turn and want to start going the other way, and that's because the center of gravity is pulling it in the direction of travel.
Right. Go. All right. So what about proficiency?
Go beyond currency. Go beyond your 3 takeoffs and landings. I mean, nobody's watching you generally when you're doing your takeoffs and landings. Yeah, there's 3 of them, but how good were they? Make them count. Do spot wheel landings is always fun. Practice your power off approaches and landings. And again, you can decide. You don't have to say, I'm going to do a wheel landing this time, or I'm going to do a 3-point landing this time. You can actually make your mind up at the appropriate time, depending upon what the conditions are. Right now, you may think you're coming in for a wheel landing and then realize quickly, I think I'm going to convert to a 3-point or vice versa. I like the fact that the wheel landing has a little bit more energy. So you've got some energy in reserve if you need it when doing power off approaches. I like that idea. So generally, I plan for a wheel landing when doing a power off. And remember, power is a flight control.
That's right. Oops, hold on, don't know what I clicked on there. What happened there? There we go. And then
Tail dragon. That's that very pretty looking PA-11 Cub Special that we had had at AOPA for a while.
Yes, that was a nice airplane. All right, I know that this brings us to the official hour end. Let me just jump to that part. I'm just going to go right to here. I believe there are some reference slides that you'll see that Steve purposely put in there, knowing we wouldn't get to them in the presentation, but they will be available when we put this up on YouTube. There'll be a link to it, and I know that a couple folks put email addresses in. They just asked if Stephen would send them, and so if you hit us up there, we can do that. But Stephen, you want to tell us quickly as we come to the official hour end here for those that want to get their wings credit? This has nothing to do with wings credit though, because remember, if you're looking for wings credit, you don't need to do anything as long as you gave us and registered with the email that you use for FAAsafety.gov. This is a separate thing. So Stephen, tell us just quickly about this.
All right, correct. I will pull the attendance list, and the wings credit comes from that. This, as a separate thing, is the Pilot Passport, which is embedded in our AOPA app. And what we've gotten there is an online airport directory. Essentially, you can look up different airports around the country. It does use your GPS, if you have it enabled, to tell you which ones are closest to you. And you can check in at those airports and you earn little badges, earn points, and rewards and things through that. That's just it gamifies visiting other airports and traveling around the country. And as a special thing, our marketing folks make a badge that is unique to our presentation. So you can put in this code and get a badge for attending today.
And the steps are right there on the side. So you go to the menu inside the AOPA app, and then go to Pilot Passport, My Pilot Passport, and then put that code in. But as we know, Stephen, maybe hold off, jot this code down, hold off, because what happens is our audience, you guys are awesome, but sometimes you crash the app because so many people go in and try to do it all at once and then it doesn't work. So just jot that code down, YCF as in you can fly, web as in webinar, 061523. That's just June 15th, 2023 is the code. So check that out.
The server's not made for lots of requests all at the same time. So keep your shirts on and give us some time.
And there it is. That might be the last of the shirts. Hey, just real quick before we are going to stick around. Steve's going to stick around and answer questions and go over some of the ones you've had. But for next month on July 20th at 12 to 1 Eastern or 1600 UTC, we're going to be doing the XC Factor, that famous show that you may have seen on the air. And it's honing your talent for cross-country flying. Basically, we're going to combine a couple of the requests that we had from last month when we asked. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the weather minimums, how to remember those. We'll talk about some of the types of airspace. We've talked about airspace a lot in the past couple of months. So we'll sort of put and integrate some of that into a sample cross-country flight. And maybe we'll do a theme where we're heading up to Oshkosh or something like that. So we're going to talk about all those good things and flight following. And in fact, when it comes to flight following, if you would, or if you have any ideas for future topics you'd like to let us know about, either put them in the chat or hit us up at ftinitiative. You see the email address right here, ftinitiative@aopa.org. Let us know things that you want to see on next month's webinar. If it's about flight following, what are your specific questions? Because I know that everybody's always asking about that. Or if you've got ideas that you'd like to see for future topics, like this tailwheel one that we put on. It was a request often requested by our audience. Let us know what you'd like to learn about, and we will be glad to see if we can help you out. All right. That said, I think the shirt thing has been taken care of. That does not mean another one. I think we're all good to go there. Let's go ahead and hit some questions up. Dan, you want to help us out and tell us what folks have been asking?
Absolutely. We got one that just came in at the end, actually, which was linked further up from the beginning. I think one of our first ones, and it was about the challenges of aircraft insurance for tailwheel. And related to that second inquiry was the biggest hesitation I have with tailwheel is that you really need to buy one in order to fly one. But the insurance is either impossible to get or super expensive for low-time tailwheel pilots. So any tips on tailwheel insurance?
Yeah, you're right. It's going to cost more to insure a tailwheel airplane, and that's just based upon the risk profile that the actuaries at the insurance companies have determined. Their spreadsheet says it's, quote, more risky. What that means is claims tend to cost more money. The overall 100% absolute global solution to insurance claims is proficiency. So maintaining proficiency is really, really important. We talk a lot about this in flying clubs. We've introduced something called Wings for Clubs, where we recommend flying clubs follow the Wings Pilot Proficiency Program. And if every member takes a phase of Wings and they upload their transcripts with their insurance renewal, you will now get known as a safety conscious club. My club, when we did that the first year, saw a 27% discount on our club insurance because we're following a recognized, I mean, it doesn't get any better, does it? If you're following a pilot proficiency program and you upload documents that have FAA safety stamped all over it, I think the insurance company is going to take a look at that. Nevertheless, it is going to be more expensive, and insurance policies are likely to come with conditions and limitations. Now, it depends upon the airplane. If it's a fairly docile airplane, then the conditions of number of hours in tailwheel and all of that stuff are going to be a little bit more relaxed. But I think really the thing to do with anything in insurance is you need to let your insurance broker know what you're doing with regard to safety, and they can pass that on to the underwriter. And the Wings program is just perfect for this. You don't have to invent anything. It's all there for you. Just go up and do it. Fly 3 times a year with a CFI, keeps you better, more proficient than once every 24 calendar months. You get to do some groundwork. That's just a huge benefit. Insurance in general has gone crazy since 2019 for a number of reasons, and you can listen to our little podcast, Flying Clubs Radio edition. I think it's 3 and 14 when Drew and I rant and rave about flying club insurance, but we also talk about some solutions. The other thing to do is think about joining a flying club with a tailwheel airplane, or start one. It is going to be a little bit more expensive, but at least you have access, and you have the shared cost opportunity. You're sharing all of those higher costs with like-minded people.
There, and I was just going to say that to Steve. I was going to cue you up for that, because I thought we had several people asking, oh, it's expensive to buy one, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, well, that sounds like a good opportunity to start a club or shared ownership. So yeah.
Steve, any tips on getting back to proficiency after being grounded or being off for a while? Any tips you can provide to get back in the swing of things for tailwheel pilot?
Yeah, so fly with the CFI. Initially, treat it like that initial endorsement. I would say this is the reason why the FAA say you have to be doing particular things for currency, and I think you need to go beyond that for proficiency. So treat it like an initial checkout, effectively. If it's a new airplane to you, read the POH. Go back through some of these articles, stare at that, print out several copies of that graph and put them in all of the bathrooms in your house, so that you have a chance to sort of stare at this curve at the appropriate times, so that you can start thinking about, oh yeah, I remember that. And chair fly as well, particularly chair fly the takeoff and chair fly the 3-point and the wheel landing. But just get up there with, particularly with a CFI. And by the way, when you're flying with the CFI, make them wings flights, and now you can get your wings credits and get cheaper insurance. Yay!
And I want to say, put a follow up on that one too, because I saw somebody somewhere in there, and I may be jumping on what you were looking at, Dan, but I know somebody mentioned, how do you find a place to train with tailwheel and/or finding a CFI to work with you on a tailwheel? Any recommendations?
That was the next one. Perfect.
All right.
Yeah, so there are a few flight schools around, particularly the ones that would teach upset recovery, spins, and all of those sorts of things. Aerobatics, they generally have tailwheel aircraft, and they're the ones I think to work with for your endorsement. Not to frighten yourself silly doing aerobatics, but to have good training and good solid training from an experienced CFI. You really do want to find a CFI who's done it before. It sort of helps.
What could
a
go
lot
wrong?
of independent, you may be more successful with independent CFIs rather than flight schools. And the other thing to do is wander around the airport on a nice sunny Saturday or Sunday morning, and everyone's out with their pride and joys and cleaning them up and so on. Have a chat with the folks with their Citabrias or their Super Cubs and say, hey, who do you use for your flight review? Who do you use for advanced training and so on, and get the word out like that. I think you can also go on to, do you list in your flight school finder, Chris, do you list like tailwheel as a specific skill?
Yes, I don't know if it's directly in the flight school finder, but when you get to those listings, and I know in the AOPA airport directory, I believe tailwheel is listed in there if they offer it. So schools can list that sort of service.
Yeah, and you can do the same thing with the Flying Club Finder, by the way. Go into the AOPA Flying Clubs Finder, and there's like a search box you can put in your state or zip code or whatever, so you zoom in on the map. But there's also on the left-hand side, there are various filters, and you can filter on tailwheel, for example, to see which flying clubs have tailwheel aircraft.
The Flight School Finder does have that criteria for filter as well.
Great.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan.
Absolutely. So technique question, is it recommended, wise, smart, good practice to zigzag down a taxiway in order to see straight ahead?
A lot of that really depends on whether you can see. So if you're trying to taxi a P-51, even better, of course, would be a Spitfire. But if you're trying to taxi those, and you really don't have any option, you cannot see ahead of you. You have to use the side windows. And the way to do that is to have nice, slow, regular S-turns as you're going down. Now, of course, I've just spent a whole bunch of time telling you about how to stay straight when you're taxiing and the importance of control inputs and so on. bear in mind also with that big tail surface hanging but back below those main wheels, you get a lot of weather veining effects, wind veining as well. So you've got to be really conscious of that. So a lot of it will really depend. If you're in a fairly standard type of like Citabria where you can generally see over, particularly we short people might need a cushion or something, then you don't necessarily have to. So it's whether or not you need to. It looks cool as long as you don't end up ground looping on the ground because you've overstretched that angle. Remember that angle, that critical angle? So just keep the S turns nice and shallow so that you can see where you're going.
Speaking of Citabrias, this came from Bobby the Citabria guy. Can you address short field takeoff versus standard takeoff, particularly on grass where there might be a little extra drag from the higher grass?
Yeah. So and Citabria, I love Citabrias. A lot of time in 7 ECAs and BCGCs. They're just great aircraft. I think it's fairly similar, Bobby, to any type of short field takeoff. And in this particular case, you may want to sort of conjoin a short field and a soft field because you want to get out of the sticky stuff. So you want to treat that as a soft field. So you want to get airborne as quickly as you can, but you also want to get off as quickly as you can. I find the best technique is to hold the tail down until you get to a very particular speed, maybe even like 5 knots below VX, and then just make a really smart rotation. Now, of course, the tail's down, so you've got to push forward just a little bit to get that extra little speed, but then rotate it up, making sure that you're not hitting the tail wheel when you put that fairly high angle of attack. You can do it on the numbers. VX is typically about plus 12 degrees pitch. So you can sort of get airborne a little quicker, get out of the muck by doing your soft field technique, and then just climb out at plus 12. I think you'll find if you try and do that with the numbers, it will help a lot.
Cool. Hey, real quick, let me hit 2 things I just saw here. One being somebody was asking about the presentation. It will be available when we post this to YouTube. There'll be a link for that. And then I know that's for some folks, if they were looking for it, yeah, Stephen already put it in the AOPA pilot channel. But the other one was, I saw this, somebody was asking about that wings for flying clubs. Is that an actual program or you're just doing wings in your flying club? Can you just describe that again, Steve?
Yeah, so it's something, it's not an actual FAA program. What we're saying is if a flying club adopts wings and all the members adopts wings as their safety program, their safety management system, essentially, and it's a requirement, it's a safety requirement that you do at least 3 wings knowledge activities or attend seminars like this because there's wings credit for this particular seminar. And then you also go and fly 3 times a year with a CFI to a wings flight activity. There are specific wings flight activities. If everyone does that, there's a couple of advantages. You're flying, again, to an FAA sanctioned and provided safety system, but you also know that your club colleagues are also flying to the same standards. And that's a nice feeling when you know the last person who flew the airplane is actually flying with the same level of proficiency and hopefully care as you are. So it's not a formal FAA program. It's a way for flying clubs to take advantage of the program and make it their own.
Cool.
On that topic, I mean, I would strongly suggest that the safety officer of any flying club becomes a FAST team rep. Call up your local FSDO, talk to the FAST team program manager. It's a couple of online courses, and now you can become a safety advocate on behalf of the FAA for your flying club. I do that. I'm a lead rep for the now Portland FSDO. I do a lot of safety programs. I do a lot for flying clubs, my flying club, but I also open up my flying club safety programs to local pilots just to share the love.
Cool. Here's an interesting one. Recognizing the difference of angle of attack of a conventional gear and tricycle gear. I've seen a tricycle gear in ground effect. They went ahead and raised the flaps to create a smooth landing. Would that work with a tail wheel because of the different angle of attack on landing? Have you heard of that technique?
Yeah. So again, it sort of depends. Remember, it's when you're in that 3-point attitude that you get that sort of natural built-in angle of attack. And that's why when you're coming into a 3-point landing, you really, I mean, you need to be on the stall. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point. You need to bring the aircraft in, and as you sort of slightly flare into that 3-point landing, there it goes, and now you're down. And when you're down, even with that positive angle of attack, you're getting increasing friction, the power's back to idle. You don't have any extra lift now to be able to take you off, because why? Well, you're at the full stall. The 3-point landing is often called the full stall landing for that very reason. The wheel landing, on the other hand, is where you're sort of coming in a little level and you touch down on the mains. And there's a whole technique on it, and I've not taught much about that technique. It's essentially you come in fairly level, and it's what I call, you seek out the pavement. You seek it out. You don't force it down. You seek it out. And as soon as you feel those wheels spinning, just touching, spinning up, you push forward on the stick. Now, in order to be able to stay like this, rather sort of coming in like this, you've probably got a little bit more speed, you've got a bit more energy, right? The angle of attack is fairly neutral. I think probably on a wheel land, I think on any of those landings, when I think about your question, either of those landings, deploying flaps at the last minute is not going to end well, because it's going to give you increased lift, whatever is going to happen, and that's likely to surprise you. So I'm not sure I would recommend that technique.
It was actually retracting the flaps a notch or so. So it was going the other way.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're on the ground, just like you would for any short field landing, right? The best short field landings are as soon as you touch down, you want to be dumping the lift to get most of the weight onto the main wheels, and that works both ways. So yes, I would absolutely suggest that. Now, bear in mind again, with a tail wheel, which is a little more squirrely when you're on the ground, if all you have to do is reach forward and use an electrical switch, but on a lot of draggers you've got a Johnson bar and it's like down here, and now you're on the ground, you're slow, things are going squarely, all the directional controls taking place, and now you're changing your sight picture, trying to retract the flaps. So if it's a Johnson bar, I'd probably say maybe not until you're nice and firmly on the ground, and perhaps even when you're stopped off the runway. But if you can get to the flaps reasonably quickly, it's going to dump the lift and keep you on the ground a bit more.
Cool. When taxiing with a tailwind, what is a good way to determine whether to use forward or rearward stick, or is it always stick back?
No, it actually isn't. And in the reference slide, you'll see I put an approximation for that. So we're taxiing along, and we have a stiff tail wheel, so a tailwind. So think about what you want to do here. You want to keep the tail wheel on the ground. So think about the elevator position that's forcing that wind from the back to be pushing on the elevator in its particular configuration that is forcing the wheel down. Most of the time, that's going to be stick full back. If you have a raging a tailwind, you really might want to change your configuration slightly. Have the stick, rather than full back, having it perhaps neutral. You don't usually go full forward, and I mean that's not going to end well anyway. If you have such a tailwind, that it's going to be causing that sort of problem. So I think you can judge it also. Again, it's something that requires a little bit of skill, but you can actually just sort of push forward on the stick a little bit, and you can feel the tail getting a bit light, and you start losing some of the steering, and well, perhaps I need to be back a little bit more. So essentially, if the velocity, if the magnitude of the tail wheel is greater than the effect of the slipstream and the forward moving component of wind, then you probably want to be going slightly neutral rather than full back.
Cool. Any learning challenges in tailwheel aircraft that you're aware of for left-handed people?
No, I read an article recently, I can't remember where it was, about left and right-handed people. It wasn't just specifically for tailwheel, it was just for I guess for general flying. Mm-hmm. And the conclusion was it's not so much to do with what hand you feel most comfortable with, it's which part of the brain perhaps might be being used when using the different hands, right? There's the different sort of, hemispheres and so on. But the conclusion was, nope, doesn't make a difference.
Very good. If a tailwheel starts to badly shimmy after landing, what should you do?
Well, if it's a really bad shimmy, it's going to cause you, it could cause you directional or steering types of problems. Usually once those shimmies get going, if you look on a tail wheel, you'll notice there's no shimmy dampener on most of these. And it's just because of the physics. The angle of this thing is hanging back so much that it tends to want to stay straight. And so it's usually if you've landed with perhaps the tail wheel is not itself straight. It's a bit of a sort of interesting when you think about it, because you're coming in with a bit of a slip. So what's happening to the tail wheel steering? Now, of course, as soon as it goes on the ground, the spring starts stretching and so on, and the thing will straighten itself up. Specifically to your question, I would power up immediately. And the reason I would power up is so that you're getting a bit more energy, and I would raise the tail. Raise the tail. If you've got enough runway left, bring the tail back down nice and slowly, and presumably, and I would imagine the shimmy would stop unless there's some major mechanical problem that's causing it to do that. But if you just a little bit of power, remember power is a flight control, push the nose forward a little bit, bring the power back slowly, let the tail wheel kiss onto the ground, nail the tail now, and you'll probably be all right.
Very good. Another Citabria fan recently received their tail wheel endorsement. During my training, we never used the flaps for landing. Is this common practice? I was always taught to use the flaps when flying a tricycle gear.
So congratulations on your tail wheel endorsement, by the way. You're going to love it. I wonder if that's a CFI specific thing rather than anything else. If a tailwheel aircraft has flaps, it has flaps for a reason. You could argue one of them might be so that you can do shorter takeoffs. I think the other is for the very purpose of flaps, that you can have a very nicely controlled descent rate at a slower approach speed. So just with any airplane, if they're plain flaps and they're essentially barn doors, the first notch of flaps is going to give you quite a substantial change in lift without much change in drag. But as soon as you start hanging them all out, then you've got that big drag profile, and that can cause problems initially. So maybe your instructor was helping you understand the landing characteristics of a tailwheel airplane without deploying this massive amounts of extra drag that can happen with these big flaps. I would suggest you start experimenting with it. Just try different flap settings, see what you're comfortable with. The other thing without flaps, of course, you're coming at a slightly faster airspeed. That gives you a little bit more energy to get out of trouble. And again, if we're training in the Citabria, there could have been a frightened CFI in the seat behind you who's spring loaded, and they may just want that little bit of extra buffer of energy and therefore control. So I would suggest you try it. Go out and try and experiment.
Very good. Mark Y is a high time decathlon pilot and asks the question, how important is it to transition train when like trying out different aircraft, different tailwheel aircraft? His decathlon solos from the front seat, transition to an extra solo from the rear seat.
Yeah, I'm a real believer in transition training for anything that you haven't flown before or haven't flown recently. I think it's really important to recognize that even an airplane that you've got many hours in, if you haven't flown it for a while, and you've now generated the muscle memory and habits of the airplane you have been flying most recently, and they are different. I remember just jumping in between different Citabrias, or between a Citabria without flaps and a decathlon, super decathlon with the symmetrical wing. Very, very different beasts. Particularly on the approach and the landing. So I'm a strong advocate, and I'm a CFI. I like to have business as well, but I firmly believe that transition training counts not just between major types, but between models as well.
Good. So I've gotten through the list that I have clipped and saved here. So I think we're there, guys.
Perfect. I did see somebody asking again about Wings for Clubs, and as Steve just mentioned before, it's not a program in and of itself, but basically have everyone in the club use the FAA Wings program, and if the entire club does that and uploads those documents, that could be helpful.
Yeah, I'd say it's a bit more than that. I mean, make it a formal program, because then you will benefit many. You'll get many benefits. Have a look at, do a search for AOPA flying clubs, then look at the box that says Club Connector newsletter, and look at question of the month. We've been publishing this for 7 years now. There's lots of really good stuff in there. And scroll down and you'll find something about how can my club ensure all members are proficient or something like that. That's where we introduce the idea of Wings for Clubs. Also on Flying Clubs Radio, do a little Google search. It's not a podcast that you can play on wherever you get your podcasts, but it's an audio file. And there's a couple of different places there that we talked about Wings for Clubs. It's really catching on, and it's catching on for the right reasons, insurance, but also the main benefit, which is proficiency.
Right. And you can't go wrong with that. All right. Well, I think that does bring us to our official end. We ended it officially for the Wings credit part about an hour or about a half an hour ago on the hour. But just a reminder, next month we'll be back July 20th, the week before Oshkosh, with the XC Factor, honing your talent for cross-country flying. Obviously, want to thank Steve. Thanks so much for being with us this month. We really appreciated it. I know that we had several people thank us and it said that they had mentioned requesting this tailwheel thing, and they've been asking about it for a little while. So it was just really good to have you. And I thought, who's going to be my tailwheel guy? I thought of you, so I'm glad you came on and helped us with this one this month.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.
And then for Dan and Steve, as always, of course, happy birthday again, Dan, as we get ready to sign off. But let's go ahead, I guess, Steve or Steven, and we'll shut it down, and we'll see you guys next month. Thanks for being with us.
All righty, gentlemen.